afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the IFS UK and Ireland User Group Summer Conference. Thank you for supporting our events. I hope we find you all safe and well. We're very sad not to be seeing everybody at our annual conference, and we hope that our summer conference will help make up for the absence of the actual conference this year. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Miller and I'm the manager of the User Group. The User Group is run by a committee of volunteers who all work for IFS customers. We also have a couple of committee members who work for IFS and who assist us with liaison between our members and the company. The User Group is independent of IFS, which allows us the freedom to react to requests from our members. As members, we need you to stay in touch with us and to let us know if ever you have any concerns or requests that you'd like us to follow up on your behalf. The presentation today has been supplied by two members of the IFS UK and Ireland User Group Committee, Malcolm Burrows, IT Manager at Butcher's Pet Care, and Paul Dryden, IT Director at Farrow & Ball. They have also involved our partners ProDBA. And the title is Data Housekeeping. This event will take you through the nuances between what IFS say and the real world experiences, the basics of backing up Oracle and IFS with advice on how to strengthen your backup options, an overview of essential maintenance from ProDBA and release management approaches. If you'd like to ask any questions during the presentation, please do so using the Q&A option. Please add your names to any questions so that we know who's asking, and I'll put all the questions to our presenters at the end of the presentation. If we don't manage to get through all the questions today, I will ask for them to be answered after the event. The event today will be recorded and the recording will be available to all our members on our website from next Monday. Today, we're very pleased to have on the webinar Andrew Lowner, who's an IFS consultant at ProDBA. He was born and raised in Scotland, attended Heriot-Watt University, where he graduated with a master's degree in physics. He's been in the IT industry for the last 7 years and joined ProDBA in 2017. As part of ProDBA, he has lots of experience with Oracle and plenty of technical knowledge about its operation and best practice. He joined the IFS team at ProDBA in 2018 and have had experience working with IFS versions 7.5, Apps 8, Apps 9 and lately Apps 10. Andrew is a technical expert and will assist with questions at the end of this presentation. We also have Gary Parker, who is an IFS consultant with ProDBA. He's been with ProDBA since October 2016 and he looks after the IFS team. He first started working with IFS in 2005 on version 2004 and has completed various projects and roles with businesses. This is continued with subsequent versions, App 7, App 7.5, App 7.5 SP6, Apps 8, Apps 9 and now Apps 10. Paul Dryden is the IT Director at Farrow & Ball. Paul has more than 20 years experience in selling, supporting and reshaping IT offerings for a wide range of businesses. With a keen eye on business value, Paul has a proven track record of ensuring user experience, service and applications are fit for purpose and deliver value to the business. For just over 6 years, Paul has headed up IT for Farrow & Ball, a premium paint and wallpaper business with global retail operations. But first, I'm going to hand you over to Malcolm Burrows, who has been the IT manager at Butcher's Pet Care for 20 years. Malcolm has worked in IT and engineering related IT since 1992. He's more of a generalist, but since working with IFS systems, he's focused on the business system side. Less hands-on now, his current focus is moving IFS forward so that it sits as core to everything that butchers do. Malcolm joined the IFS User Group Committee in 2016. Outside of work, Malcolm enjoys sound engineering, making furniture and photography. You may well have seen him taking photographs at our annual conference. I shall hand you over to Malcolm.
Good afternoon. Very quickly, a brief bit about Butchers. We're a family-owned firm. We still remain so, and we're still moving things forward. We also have a factory that's built in 2010. We've been in since 2011. The company is still producing canned dog food, and currently we're actually #1 for reselling of canned dog food in the UK. So we are ahead of pedigree as an independent. Our journey When we looked at systems in 2004, we introduced IFS with a go live in 2005. We had very old systems that were disparate. They really didn't actually hold anything together. They were just migrated purely into IFS, and we went on from there. When you do this, you have to remember that IT actually aren't exempt from panicking being an obstacle. So part of that culture change is how you bring your team, how you bring everybody on board. The company as a team made that decision to bring IFS in. Oracle's a new thing for us, big changes in how we do things. A very small team. At that time, only had one other person, a systems admin. Challenge number one. IFS, when they come in 2004, we were given the reassurance that everything will go in and IFS will assist and it will be all okay. This is good and bad because you are giving the systems over for them to carry on and do things, but you are also sometimes in the dark as to what you should be doing next because you are adding and configuring, you're learning things. The problem we had with just 2 people and the go live date that was set is the training for Oracle was going to happen outside of the go live date. So you're actually a bit behind the curve. And when you're at that point, you are beginning to chase things. Because IFS at that point configure, install, set up everything for you, and you're with that naive knowledge of trying to take this thing home, it becomes a bit different. During go live, you're not concentrating necessarily on backup and recovery because you're moving things forward. Yes, it can be, you might get involved in how that happens and how you do things. This became a latter stage in the project, and you need to make sure it works. So during the project, we're fortunate in how we operated, what we were using, and knowing that the platform we put in place for this was actually quite solid, but it wasn't without risk. At this point, we were using cold backups to make sure we had things in place, essentially because we felt more comfortable with that and we could bring the whole thing back as a complete block, and it was quicker than using tape or anything else at this point. The how do I recover when it goes wrong after go live, because you're at this point whereby you've literally had a baby, you've gone home, it's now yours to actually look after. That realization that you are now a responsible person, but not only just for the database, you're the company actually on your shoulders at this point, because everybody is looking for this to actually go right, work, be a success. So you have hidden pressures, hidden emotions going on between you, teams, and everybody else around you. We had a recovery plan for this. We had a go live plan, and we tested with RMAN using backup software to tape. Tested well, worked fine during pre-go live. It worked for 4 days during the first week of go live where we didn't have a problem. And then it went wrong. So on the Friday evening of the first week, I went on holiday and a call at midnight to say everything wasn't working. Essentially, RMAN going to tape, there was a sequence flaw whereby the database was coming up while the buffer to get the information to tape was actually going on. And where am I? I'm actually in a field in Cornwall, sorting out this over the weekend on the Monday when IFS come back online. In the end, it was just purely a table that had not come online when it came back up. So small things can cause big issues. Our simplified backup after that point was to drop the tape backup altogether. We had the luxury of being able to use cold backups for the production database, It was quicker to do this than it was anything else. We had disk capacity, we knew where everything was going, and at this point within the company, this window of 40 minutes was all we needed. Reality was the database was backing up in less than 10 minutes back in 2006-7 onwards, and we were in a good place. The 40-minute window, just in case we needed to do anything else, patching, etc. So we had a window to actually control that. The diagram essentially is just showing there that running robocopies and batch jobs to actually take things down and scheduling everything, so it was all automated. This ran like this up until 2016, when we just changed things slightly. This is where we began to bring on ProDBA. 2017 we upgraded to apps 9. Big difference in IFS's project management approach. This was very much a grown-up IFS project management team. Plus, we knew what we were expecting. We knew people now at IFS. We knew what we had to do. You still needed to actually have definition of roles, responsibilities, capabilities, and making sure that you've got the specification running correctly. In building and going forward, don't just rely on the fact it's a bit of tin. We took time on this project to actually go out to our hardware supplier. Because we use HP, we use the HP box, but we got HP to actually go through and pre-build this box to make sure it was the best thing that we could for Oracle. Because of that understanding of technology, it went in, we changed everything network-wise at this point as well. So our storage and our backbone to all the storage went from the normal 1 gig backbone to a 20 gig backbone between all servers. We changed all the disks to flash array. So we had a foundation which this was all going to be built on, and we knew it was going to actually work, and we could actually have, if we had a performance issue, then we could track it down fairly quickly. That engagement with our suppliers was actually quite key in being able to deliver. We do everything on-prem. We still do that purely at that point because our internet connection was actually pretty shocking. All that's changed in the last 12 months. So we've got things that we're planning ahead for, but making sure that you're working with and asking questions, and going through your team as well to make sure that you've got all their ideas and solutions is actually quite critical in making sure you've got ownership within the company. Challenges with IFS, the upgrade was a crazy weekend. The migration from 2004 to apps 9 is a 2-stage, so you had to go to 7.5 and then to 9. This is all handled remotely by the guys in Sri Lanka. This actually went really well. Pre-tests went without a hitch, so we knew that the time span we had to get all this done. Again, hardware availability and configuration key on this. That technical specification became more difficult when we came to the managed server side. We started off apps 9 with a managed cluster for the middleware, whereby we had a load balancer and 4 instances of the managed server. Getting that load balance right, getting it running, took a little bit longer than we expected because it was made to sound fairly easy. Also a reality that because you have a managed cluster, you would expect that you could turn one side off to update and do a release and then do the second one without losing time. It doesn't work like that. You'd actually lose both, you have to take it all down because it's doing database as well as managed server. So you are still going to have downtime, which was something we weren't quite expecting, and even though we'd asked that question several times. We also found the database has increased in size, which is something you kind of think, well, there might be a bit of increase, but we went from an 80 gig database at that point. When it came back and went live, we were 125 gig before we started. So it's quite a size increase that we weren't expecting. Fortunately, the way we have the drive spaced, and we have plenty of space to go and deal with that, but you're then going to be monitoring what growth rate you're going to have when you go live. Change your backup plan. We needed IFS to be running with no stoppages now. So no interruption in production. So we talked with ProDBA. We moved everything to an online RMAN solution, and we've been running that ever since. Archive logs, key to this, so that you can roll things back. We only run backup once a day. And even though that's going to disk to start with, it actually is quite a slow process. So old cold backups, even with 125 gig, they were around 20 minutes on the new servers. RMAN in this version takes about an hour and a half. So you've got to be prepared for changes on how that works. The load balance managed servers, great. Except we never actually saw a real need for them in the end, because the loading and how they get used and what you see as memory usage, CPU usage, you'll see later, isn't quite where it should be. And the other challenge, releases and configurations, because as I mentioned earlier, you still have to take the whole system down. You need downtime to do some of these releases and updates. And you're going to take the whole system out. So that for us is a Saturday. So be prepared that it's not going to stay online all the time. Current backup plan is this. So we're using RMAN. There's an online backup that gets copied to an archive area with the archive logs. That area is then used for ProDBA to clone our databases, so to test, to dev, to pilot, and at the same time we have that moved to our DR site, so that we have a VM that mimics, that it is updated occasionally, but not actually turned on, of the actual Oracle server, so that when we need to, or if we have to in a disaster recovery, that VM we turn on and we update with the backup that's been taken. So we have that in place. Much cleaner, much simpler than the previous one. None of this now goes to tape. It's all actually on disk. We've got good speed between all. Things we monitor once we're live. So we look at sessions, how long they're running for, make sure that the processes are not hanging, locks, etc. We have had locks which have been caused by some third-party software. All those at the moment have gone away, so we're in a good position, but they can be a problem, and those locks, you need to be aware of them, because we supply 24-hour support. We get those calls, or we have those calls in the middle of the night, no more. Table space, make sure they're set to auto increase. We still monitor them, we still check, because when you see the picture later, it looks horrendous because everything's red, but that's because you've got auto extend in place. Job errors, warnings. These help identify where problems could occur in the future, things you need to address. There's a good lobby that you can use in Apps 9 out of the box, which we use all the time to see what's going on. And we've tweaked one or two things to give us a bit more information. Microsoft updates, not IFS related, but they are. You need to manage these carefully. One, on managed servers and the database server, do not have them auto-updating. Keep them so that you're actually controlling when you're going to do those updates. We found in our test systems where auto-updates come into the managed server, that if they're set to auto, you suddenly find that things stop working. Things to be aware of. So always control Microsoft updates if you're on an MS box. Server load, just make sure they're in a good place. There are tools that IFS supply. We used to use Oracle tools to do this to see what's going on. But those tools under the version of Oracle we're running, which is 12C standard, really don't do anything. But fortunately, Microsoft do have, or sorry, IFS have supplied some monitoring tools there that are good indicators for you to actually go and look at. Network connectivity, not always checked, but we monitor that across the board. So we have a monitored network to see what clashes, what spikes, what jabber, what could affect anything. Because you will see within IFS when you're looking at sessions and some warnings that you have disconnected sessions. Basically, the machine's gone to sleep. When it wakes up again, a client will then come back on. So you'll get those warnings, and they're easy to read through to say, well, actually, they're not a problem, but keep an eye on them. Connectivity jobs. These are things your business will probably rely on more. So we check the EDI background jobs. We check the things that are not stuck. This also comes back into the errors that we see in the admin lobby. How do we use ProDBA? Very simply. Database cloning from live to environments, test dev, pilot, etc. When we struggle with locked processes, identifying these, we use them to assist to actually kill those processes and get us into the place where we need to be. And also advice. Advice is something that we use from all the time. So in future planning of what we're aiming to do, we're looking at how we can recover better and making things happen a little bit more, I suppose, online rather than just as we are. And they have good ideas and they have good practice, and we trust them. These are some of the screenshots of screen monitoring. The middle section where you're seeing IFS middleware server, we used to have something in there, but update 13 took that out. So we have a basic screen when you go in there. These are some of our system monitorings for a live server. The 14% that's in the red is because there is one job on there when I took this that says killed, but it actually was hogging still, but it's not causing us an issue. So we'll deal with that one later on. This is the one that could frighten you. In the database, this is your disk management. So it tells you what your usage is. Again, the active ones that are filling up, it will go through and it will tell you. Current database size is around 242 gig currently. Looking at what's taking up the time of processing, this is a good one as well. It's a bit more confusing because these are cumulative values here. These really, you kind of want to just see an instances as to what that is, but it's not actually telling you the truth. So we don't, it has a time elapsed total of 2 hours and 7 minutes. But we only actually, it takes, that longest job takes 4 minutes, which is a cleanup job. Again, what is happening? Good graphics to go through. You can dive down into these and you can find out more. So on the managed server side, we have actually got rid of the balance because in 13, a release horror update whereby 3 attempts, on the 3rd attempt, we didn't actually have a system on managed servers during the update. So we reversed out the load balance set and it brought it back to 2 so that I had an operational system by the time that people came back into work. we've remained with that since, and even with just one server and 2 managed servers in it, you can see my load is not very big. And again, heap memory it fluctuates. It's well in control. We're not keeping anything with that. With your scheduled tasks, you do get easy monitoring. So the yellow dots show that we've had warnings on these jobs, and the yellow warnings on the particular ones, you look through it, it's a company that doesn't always post into General Ledger, so hence it goes yellow, gives you a warning. This is the dashboard that's out the bag. It tells us everything that we need to know out of instance, so you can click and drill down on these, and we use this quite a bit just to see what's going on and monitor how many users. Now this is Task Manager view for both managed server and the database in live. You can see how this changes between what we actually have available and what those other monitoring within IFS are saying. This is probably more accurate as to what's being used. We've found with the managed server, disk space is actually quite key to that operating without falling over. So the more space you give where those managed servers are, the better it'll actually work. We've not had any unresolved issues in successes and failures, which is a good thing. Anything that we've had have either been resolved by us or by IFS. And IFS have improved in the time that we've used them. It's gone from not a good experience to actually quite a good experience in replying and getting on with things, which is certainly a bonus for us. We have our outages, some third-party integration issues. Again, you need to monitor, you need to know why. One of the early ones, which is why we brought on ProDBA, was we had a table that should have been set to auto extend that didn't, and it locked everybody out. We had another one on the 2004 side whereby the archive log area filled up. It tells you it's filled up, but again, if you're not savvy with what you need to do that, to get around that, it can cause an issue. So having an external partner or a source of resource to do that is good to have. We've not had a lot of performance issues. In 2004, there were more performance issues over indexing. In Apps 9, we've not seen that. Table indexes, etc., are more self-governing and better governing than they were previously. And you don't want to be re-indexing all the time, because your database will increase in size every time you do that. We've had fires. We had a fire in November, which didn't stop production. We were very fortunate. The fire was actually in the server room, two racks down from the main system. Be prepared for it, because there are things that you'll plan for with IFS to make it all run, but there are things outside of that that will have an impact. Release installations for Apps 9, again, it's things you need to test, run with, go through. We tested all the updates prior to going live, but we still got caught out going live. They are not always an easy solution, and if you're taking responsibility in-house, make sure you've got some resource available if you need to call on it to actually assist you with it. App updates 11 and 13 were rolled together on ours. We used IFS as our backup and take us through to make sure the hand holding was there. Over 3 days, that was something like 36 hours, and all in 3 separate occasions. Only on the 3rd occasion did we actually get the thing in, even though in test it worked fine. In summary, plan well. Implementing IFS and anything really, just make sure that you're focused on that, but also look at the wider processes and things around you. They could have an impact on what you're doing. This goes without saying. Now I put people and support at the end on this. People actually potentially goes at the front. Without the people you have in your team and having them on board and having good people, the other bits really become a struggle. Brainstorm. There's no harm in taking time out of doing this before you start and actually going back, look at what the state you have, rate your gap analysis on what you're doing. Make sure the business know that as well. Stakeholders, they're key, and you must make sure that if you are having problems or you found something in your gap analysis, make sure that people are aware of it. And don't be afraid to say you need help. My skill set isn't up to it in this area. Honesty will actually save you pain, but also it's one of those whereby people are going to be looking at you post this as well as while you're doing it, and you need to make sure you've got support level with you to actually make that happen. And review often. We all need to adapt. It's no good sitting on your laurels, say, yeah, we've got backup sorted, we know what we're doing with this. Keep on reviewing it, keep on reviewing what technology is there. Look at how you can do things better, look at how you can actually enhance things without causing pain. Listen to others as well. You have users who say, well, I can't do this, or this is slow. When anybody says to us, IFS is running slow, we look at this quite quickly because we know that the system is running very efficiently. You'll find that on some of this, where the clients are having issues, it's actually the client end. You may have to actually delete the profiles that are hidden in the user area on the PCs. Often resetting this brings it back in line. They can get a bit clogged up, and they can create multiple sessions that actually lock out each other in that area. And over to Paul.
Cool, thank you. Malcolm, I guess. Yay, hello. Yeah, I'm going to cover off a bit of background because I think Malcolm's taken us through a really good kind of what happens for each organization, and pretty much has skipped over a huge amount of bits where he's applied his experience and kind of coming into that. But I'm kind of taking the view of having come into quite a lot of organizations, both as a owner of that internal infrastructure and what we're doing, also pretty much when I've been on the other side of the fence of selling services in, what do we actually need to do to make the case for that investment in backup and so on? Because all too often we find that we as IT professionals are the ones that are carrying that on our shoulders, and that sometimes the wider business isn't ready to kind of gear up for it. So what will happen in my slides is I'll take you through effectively how I set out looking at that as a case with IFS as the specific. So if I go over to my slides and I share them, because that's the kind of key part of it. Trust me, I am a professional. Cool. So yeah, what I'm going to cover off is really kind of just going through the basics of it, and I think we have to start with the environment, which Malcolm kind of laid out pretty well. Is the backup location isolated enough is the key one that we've kind of come across time and time again, where backups may be on a device that is actually just as much at risk as the main servers, etc. You saw the map of thing. I haven't really covered what Fire and Ball do because I think by now people are probably a bit sick of it, but we're quite in a diverse site where basically we're spanning over Nissen huts. So we've got quite a lot of cable that could be at risk. And what we need to look at is, do we have enough diversity on site, or do we need to look for the cloud or colo, etc.? And I think that's the first part that you need to look at and engage your risk assessment teams or risk management teams, whatever you've got in your organization, in kind of going, look, is this good enough to cater for all of the non-technical disasters that might come over? The next one we tend to look at is the actual day-to-day production. So if you haven't got the luxury to invest in a 20 gig backbone, which we're very jealous of, is do you actually put in just a simple backup LAN so that all of your backups are actually running over a different network alongside your day-to-day production, and therefore you can be taking those kind of real-time updates and so on coming through, or do you just plow all the money into making sure that you've actually got very nice backup and kind of going through that way. It's a question to be asked. I think you have to kind of do the commercials. It depends on what your site and so on is. But the final part of it is are there other risks to consider outside of the technical environment? And I think it's safe to say that we're talking about always be prepared. So nobody ever expects the Spanish Inquisition, being the bit of a joke that we're kind of using. However, using some real world examples, this was Fire and Ball in the summer of 2017, I believe, where we had a forklift going through a door and basically just didn't realise that the gate was up, and managed to take down an entire wall. Fortunately, touch wood, that the forklift driver was safe, and that the person whose car was crushed in the event was actually fine, because we sorted out the insurance and so on. But you can see the cables and everything that's running there, and I talked about us being Nissan huts. That actually took out quite a lot of the links that we had between us and the backup site. So for the period of a week and a half, whilst we were kind of putting that right, we had to find a different way to do our backups, which then made us think about what is actually our site resilience. I'm going to invite Malcolm back in to describe this next one, because he's kind of touched a little bit on it, but what you'll now be able to see is the actual evidence of the fire he was discussing.
Yeah, we essentially had a UPS battery that caught fire. On top of here was gear that we use for testing. So one complete NetApp array and one VM header. Totally destroyed all the way through. As I say, fortunately, this is a rack that we had literally put in there for testing, and things you don't expect to actually happen. So this was inspected and tested and given a green light in June to say that, yeah, it's all okay and no batteries needed replacing. It can catch you out.
Yeah, when we were having the discussion on actually what examples we were going to use, Andrew, Gary, Malcolm and myself basically had to stop at about 12, and then we whittled it down to 2, not to bore people, because we come across this time and time again, not in our own organisations, but actually hearing horror stories from everywhere. And we've got enough experience now that actually you know that somebody is basically getting hit with something pretty much every other month at the moment. And although it doesn't happen to one company and the risk can be spread, there's enough kind of gotchas out there that we just need to be aware of. So the diversity of route and actually the environment are kind of key in this. Kind of getting into the next kind of 2 points when we're talking about recovery time as well is, in order to drive the investment, do we want to talk about the time to recover or the point to recover to? So simply put, there's kind of 2 measures, the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective, and they're quite straightforward. The recovery point is basically how far back are you going? What's the maximum amount of data measured in time that can be lost? Is it an hour? Is it 4 hours? Is it to the last backup last night at midnight? Is it a day, etc.? Can the business rekey, replay the lost work between the last backup and now? So when you look at the recovery point objective of say 12 hours, that's 12 hours of rework if you've lost all of that. Is there a DR or a business continuity map of all the inputs that would need to be rekeyed? i.e. does everybody know? Malcolm talked earlier about the interfaces like EDI, any kind of data exchange, etc. All that kind of has to be replayed. Is there actually quite a decent map so we know what needs to be done in order and priority? And has it ever really been tested in anger? Is there a time of day where basically you can say we're deliberately going to take this down and actually dual key into the test system what's coming through then? Do we understand how much of the business resource and how many other kind of warm bodies that we need in order to kind of do that catch up? Because I think I've come across a few organisations in my time that have had, yes, it's okay, we'll kind of recover back to midnight last night. But if that disaster happens at 10 o'clock in the evening in a 24 operation, that's a huge amount of work that's been asked for. The recovery time objective is pretty much the stress one of what's maximum length and time that an application cannot be available. And this is where IT teams are actually put under a huge amount of stress in order to recover as quickly as possible. We tend to find people aren't getting sleep, that all of a sudden pizzas have been ordered in, etc. But actually, there's some of the calculations in that I find, again, people have underestimated when they put a recovery plan together and we go to test it. Is restoring the Active Directory a risk? Do we actually know how long it would take to get up to main controllers, transfer roles, etc.? I think that one's completely overlooked more times than not. Has it ever been tested in anger again, end to end? So I find a lot of people, just because of the scale of actually what needs to be recovered, tend to test parts of it, assuming that actually when you test it as a whole, it'll all string together. I don't find that is the case when we do it the first time and all. And the key one is actually, does the business know? Not I put you on the slide, but actually, does the business know what a cost of hour downtime is? Because it's not just lost productivity in terms of payroll. You've also got what sales are not coming in, what could be rekeyed if that's more than a day. Are clients going to cancel? Are people going to look elsewhere for business? Is it potentially going to get out there into the press? Are people going to be looking at the reputation of the business? I think that's quite the key thing, where when you're kind of engaging boards and management, is make it very clear what you're trying to protect against. It isn't the data. And we find a lot that people tend to work off of well, I spend X amount of pounds per gigabyte of data to back it up, etc. And that's a fine measure from a budget point of view, but I don't think it really goes the full way for actually what the value to the business is, because recovering that data, the business assumes it's going to happen, but actually recovering the workload, recovering that productivity, recovering the reputation is always going to be the critical one, and therefore kind of coming up with some of those measures. And over my experience, I've tended to work off of a kind of very basic formula, but let me take you through it. So when we look at the value of backup, let me just skip this through. I tend to take the recovery point objective. So how far back are we going to recover the data? And I cube it, because actually the key thing being that the business interruption isn't just actually for the point of the recovery. There are probably going to be ripples that you feel again and again and again, probably for a month or so, until actually everything is back to normal. Plus, so multiply that by the time to recover. So how long is the business going to be down? Multiplied by that cost of 1 hour downtime. And that 1 hour downtime can be a simple calculation of just take the daily revenue, divide it by the amount of working hours. So I've got some examples on the next slide to kind of walk you through. But then you can get a cost of what 1 hour of payroll is during peak times and off peak times from the payroll department. You can have a look at actually how much are you expected to gain in new business coming from the marketing team, and having a factor into that. So there are several elements that go into there. And then the cost of the backup per annum. Now, originally I used to spread this over a 5-year investment, but actually it kind of cancels out pretty well. So how much are you actually spending dedicated to backup per annum? And then multiply it to a power. And for me, basically, if that process is manual, you're not going to get any benefit from it, because you're dividing the whole amount by this. So if you got a manual process, whatever you're paying, you've then got people and so on top of that. If it's partly automated, you're going to see a time benefit. So square it, multiply it by itself. And actually, if it's a fully automated one, you can multiply that, power it by 3 or cube it. And what you're really looking for is a number that is trending towards 0. So as you make improvements, you want to be getting closer and closer to 0 as a view of it. So let me walk you through 4 examples that I've used. So using that scenario, the first one here is the cost of downtime. I'm assuming that all scenarios that the company's got 1 million turnover per day, because I just wanted to use something that was easily dividable. The cost of the backup solution at the moment is £45,000 per annum. The recovery time objective is 24 hours to recover from backup, and you're going to go back at no more than 12 hours to the backup point. And it's a very manual position, so the multiple in X, the power on X is 1. What that then looks like is the red bar that you can see is the cost of the downtime. The turquoise bar being the cost of the backup solution, and the multiple that it comes up with, 115,000, is off the scale. And I wasn't going to go that high because you can see later things. And the multiple really then comes into what you're looking at is what's the potential impact onto the cost of the business, reputation, etc. Whatever your business measures as its external kind of value, it could be the net promoter score, etc. There's a huge risk to the business at that point. Taking scenario 2, so pretty much the same cost and backup, but we're now looking at slight automation. So that actual recovery time objective goes from 24 hours to 4 hours, but you're still going to be going back to a point the evening before. So that kind of looks quite beneficial from a multiple, but what it doesn't account for is the amount of manpower that's going to be needed to get the systems back up to that 12-hour gap. So I think the business value in that one would be questioned, but the backup solution is getting to a point. And example here in scenario 3 is we're spending a little bit more on the backup solution to keep that kind of recovery time to 4 hours, but we've gone back to a bit of a manual triggering that has to happen. So you can see you've got a multiple of 8, which is far better than 115,000, but it's still quite high. And ultimately, if you're looking at something that pretty much is automated and you're getting that recovery time down to an hour, you pretty much are 0. So the formula, as I say, I've used it for about 10 of my 20 years in it, and it tends to work quite well. And I think when you kind of apply it to your business, and I know this is quite a confusing chart, and I'm happy to kind of take anyone through it after the fact. But if you're kind of trying to make the case for your management and your board, it's quite easy to kind of work things through, saying, here's where we are, here's what we want to do in terms of investment and get to, and this is what the risk for the business is going to be. I do find that risk committees and governance committees really like this approach, so I hope that's helpful. The next part of it is pretty much we need to look at what we're doing and what we're backing up in the first place. So we've kind of said, right, what we're going to invest. From a principles point of view, we know that we've got the Oracle database, but sitting underneath that, we've got the data files, the control files, and the redo logs. Now, there is an approach, and Malcolm talked about engaging HP to kind of say, how do we size it? Where do we position it? How do we make sure that we're not kind of creating throughput jams in terms of what the disk is asked to do when it's kind of serving that up? But he also mentioned the fact that the archive logs, the archive log files are critical, because if you're not archiving your database, you cannot recover that database in a kind of proper horrible disaster. About going back 20 years, when I first got involved with IFS, I went from a whatever the one was before to 2002B, and being quite naive at the time, didn't pay any attention to this, did the copy across. Now, fortunately, the redo logs were there in a backup, but actually having got that business into quite a mess, being a kind of quite a young naive person, then the DBAs that we had at the time were able to kind of come back in and rebuild it out for us. But that took 3 days, and to be honest, I felt quite lucky to still have a job at the end of that. So I learned that lesson quite hard earlier on, but with it, obviously the flexibility that Malcolm was talking about is all there throughout. The key thing that's running alongside it is the use of RMAN. So it's not actually as part of the Oracle database, but it is part of the Oracle offering. So it's taking the backup files. You want to make sure that you've got them off to a remote location. And we talked about the diversity of routes. And you want to basically be creating that recovery database as quickly as possible, and then apply your archive logs to it, which will always keep you up to date. How you choose to do that, I think, again, it's a very specific question, but as obviously there'll be enough people around to give advice on what that looks like. And I think Gary's going to cover off what the RMAN element actually looks like in detail as well to give a better understanding. But once that recovery database is in place, there's a couple of different options that you can go around getting that. So Malcolm talked about the physical on-prem, where you've got dedicated resource for compute, storage, and network, and you can dedicate that to ERP. So you can say to the business, I'm going to invest in ERP being completely and utterly up to speed, and everything else can basically be done as and when we want. So you can have different investment files. The benefits are you can prioritize that over any other investment. So again, you can make sure that you've got different cycles. The downside being that all those resources are now fixed for ERP. So if you do have kind of any digital transformation going on where you might need some stuff in other areas, because pretty much you're giving ERP quite a lot of stuff up front in terms of IFS and disk and compute, you might want to borrow anything. And the risk of failure is all in that hardware. So you have to have your backup solution in place and have to have it tested quite well. You can still be physical on-prem, but you can go for a virtualized environment. And that's where you get to spread your compute and your storage over a number of hosts. Virtualizing on a single host, you may as well still be physical, because there's no benefit of it. So it's going for a proper kind of array of servers and an array of storage that you can be using. And you might want to tier that. So Malcolm talked about his investment in fast disk with flash arrays, but you might want to kind of look at different things of, is your files actually in flash array, or are they kind of then just stored in normal SATA? The benefit of this is it does allow you to then also expand the resource really quickly. So as your table spaces auto expand, you can then make sure actually the disk associated with that is expanding within a pool and give you a bit more flexibility, because sometimes they do clash as a conflict where your tables have auto expanded, but your server might have actually been the thing that you've taken your eye off of. And it removes any single point of failure. However, your focus on the network becomes more. So you need to make sure that you have got that backbone. And as I say, I am jealous of 20 gig, but whatever you can afford is there. And resource thieves, I'm talking about the fact that you might actually have other virtual apps that balloon in size unexpectedly or on a backup and so on, and take that resource away from ERP. So that sizing has to be under continual monitoring and improvement as well. Or you go down the cloud route, and obviously IFS are heavily selling their managed cloud solutions. I think you have to be very eyes open on what you're going into, because effectively what you're buying there is a tiered co-location, but you do get to go pay as you go. So if you're a new business startup, or you're not that worried about capex investment and you're worried about cash flow, obviously it's a really good resource for that, because you're not investing in all your hardware 3, 4, 5 years in advance. You've got instant expansion of resource, and you can isolate the key business application from on-site. So actually, from a resilience point of view, pretty much all that physical stuff that we talked about with fires and forklifts and all the rest of it does disappear. As Malcolm intimated, you need the internet bandwidth in order to make it successful. And I think this is the kind of key one here, is you are still the one that's accountable for the sizing of the servers that you're taking on board. So everybody can sell you cloud, but actually they're not going to take any accountability for it. That still sits with us. And as a result, if you kind of do that expansion, etc., you will get bill shocks. So making sure that your budgeting process has enough that you may expect a couple of bill shocks within a 12-month period, but then do your best to avoid them. So yeah, physical virtualized cloud in terms of what the approach is. If anybody wants to discuss a specific one, either ask a question and we'll come to it at the end, or approach us individually. Taking the blend of that and the backup approaches, because just because you're physical on premises with your environment doesn't actually mean that your backup solution has to be physical as well. So the RMAN and archive log solution that we've talked about, and it will be talked about more. So probably the quickest ability to recover under your own steam. So pretty much if you know what you're doing, it's the one that you can control and you want to get into and do it. But you have to make sure that not only you, but your team or succession planning, etc., is part of that as well. The network backbone is the only limitation of how quickly you're moving these files around, etc. And you need to ensure that you've got the geographically separate locations, because we've talked about that. You can do snapshot replication on site, so taking the storage and basically having the storage mirror itself across there. You've got an instant on potential if the second instance is licensed, and Oracle are quite funny about how they kind of do the licensing for backup and test environments. So making sure that that's covered off, because they can come back quite hard. The recovery point is limited by the snapshot frequency, so you could go quicker in terms of the amount of snapshots that you've taken and reduce that recovery point down quite a lot. You just need to then make sure that you can get that across the backbone, or if it's across to another site, across the WAN, the internet line, etc. But it does allow you to then do the geographically separate locations. There's no point doing snapshot to somewhere else in the same server room. You want to be doing that to somewhere else, either far on site or in another site altogether. You can do a snapshot replication to a cloud environment, pretty much all the same thing, but you need the connectivity. You then get to recover into the cloud and bring people back to the on-prem at your leisure. It's quite actually a complex one to manage in anger, if I'm being honest, but it does give you the route diversity so that actually nothing on site is at risk. But the final kind of nth degree at the moment is the application aware backup to cloud environment, which is always instant on. So as soon as you've done a backup, it's then being recovered and tested. You're building everything to a lower one. You've got the limitation on what your cloud connectivity or your internet bandwidth is, and the route diversity is negated on site, but it can come with a pricey price tag. And there are ways that kind of Malcolm covered that you can do this yourself through other means. So again, 4 main flavors, but pretty much you have to pick the right one for you based on your business needs. So yeah, just to summarize, do your research on what the cost of downtime is for your business. That'll really allow you to start to build the case to your management teams on what needs to be invested into it. Work with your risk teams, so either a risk officer or a risk team, to model DR and really go for the stuff that could happen but nobody really thinks about. And if you're looking for some scenarios on that, again, where Malcolm says reach out for talking to colleagues and peers, etc., that's where to do it, because everybody will have come up across something you hadn't considered to that point. I mean, nothing to do with IFS, but in my history, I got called in at 3 a.m. To an office block to do DR for a company on the 17th floor because the entire floor had been flooded. The reason being that there was a 40,000 litre water tank on the roof that managed to give way and take through the entire building. That was nowhere near in any other recovery plan. So, as I say, speak to peers and speak to other people about what can happen and make sure you've got a wide range of options available. Really get the management bought into the risk that's there versus the value of what's been spent. You will get pressure to reduce the cost of backups, etc. And really, you need the management to realise you're doing this to cover their back. You're not doing it because you want some shiny toys. And that's probably one of the hardest things to do. Archive log files are gold. They should basically be treated with kid gloves wherever possible. But ultimately, pick the right approach for you. Don't let somebody else or a vendor tell you what to do. You kind of have to explore a few options and see how different people would do it and test that waters. And the key thing from that is you can pick the right partners to help. And really, you kind of want to find a partner that's actually used to kind of dealing with disasters rather than just kind of going, I've got a solution out of the box for you that'll work every time. They need to take time to understand you and actually what that approach is. And that's probably quite a good stage to then introduce ProDBA, because I haven't talked about how we use them, but pretty much the reason we're doing this with ProDBA is because I think they've saved quite a lot of our bacons over the years. But I'm now going to hand over to Gary and Andrew, who are going to take you through how they approach this and their setup. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can see my screen over here. My name is Gary Parker. I work with Andrew Lana. We're at ProDBA. We work with Malcolm and Paul Butchers and Farrow and Ball. And what I'd like to do today is just take you through some of the basics of what ProDBA do. It's a bit of a watered down version of a backup, what a database looks like, installing, doing a clone, how that process works, looking at a release, what you need to do a release, and then specifically how a release process actually works. I'm primarily looking at apps 10 here because that's the way IFS is going. If there's any questions, please get in touch with us, or through either the message board, or you can email in. All right, so let's begin. So the first thing, database backups, reasoning and types of backups. There's many options out there, but as at ProDBA, we primarily work with RMAN, which is an Oracle tool. One of the reasons, why you would backup is it always saves your latest data, which is what you want. So everything that you've done today, to a point, you want that saved. It also allows you to roll back. You can roll back to a specific point in time, or you can roll back to a specific date. It just depends on what type of backup you want to apply. It also lets you recover from disaster. And as you can see from some of the slides, I mean, there's fires, there's forklift trucks, there's vindictiveness and people pulling out plugs. Yeah, the list is endless, but there is some sort of disaster that is waiting to happen and you want to recover. You also do backups if you want to do clones, and that is where you do a backup and you want to store it, and then you specifically want to do a clone to another database, like one of your test or ref databases. So that's some of the reasons why you back up a database. Now, the different types. The first one we'll look at is a full database backup, and that's usually on a daily basis. When I say usually, it's virtually 99.9%. And it's usually done during the quieter period. So anything from, like 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And depending on the size of the database and how old the environment is, it also then depends on how long it's actually going to take. So that is a full backup. I'd say 90% of our customers will use this method because it's quick, it's easy, it's also safe. And we also at ProDBA, as part of the business, we actually monitor all this stuff and then we can install it, etc. Right, the next thing is an incremental backup. An incremental backup. Now this is, it starts at day one with a full backup. So let's say, for example, on a Sunday, it backs everything up. Then you move to Tuesday, or sorry, to Monday. Yeah, there's a day between Sunday and Tuesday, Monday, and that will take a next level. Then you move to Tuesday and it takes a next level. And at each level, basically what it's going to be doing is it only backs up the changes. So you're going to have full, then you're going to have changes, and then the next day changes, and the next day changes. And then you set the level. So I only want to go from 0 to 3. If you then want to recover level 2, then you need the pre-existing level. So you've got to go with 2, 1, and 0. You can't go out and just apply level 2. So that's just something that you need to bear in mind. Then we have something which is what we call a specific backups. And these are usually for projects, releases, or clones. And the reason why you do a specific backup is, one, if you're putting in a release, for example, you want to do an update, and the safest thing to do is back up your database in case the release goes wrong. If you're doing a project, you're going from apps 9 to 10, and there's going to be a few iterations that you're going to need to back up your database, keep it safe, and then mess around with it, and then you might want to restore that iteration. And then you want to take another iteration too, once you've done some data migration to keep it safe, do some messing around and testing, and then you might want to then restore that iteration. IFS also requests us to do iteration backups for them and keep them safe for them. So that's the basic reasoning and the types of backups that we get. So the next thing we want to look at is basically a database. And the one that I've chosen is for the apps 10 version, and they're all container databases. And now what that looks like. So first thing we have is a container database. Now this is where all the metadata is kept, and it has all the data dictionary views for the root. And inside is, as you can see, it contains the usual files, the control files, data files, temps, redos. Inside the container, we then have a seed, a PDB seed, as they call it, a seed. And this is actually a template database. And it contains a few table spaces that is used as a template, like, for example, the system, sysorgs, the temp, undo. And that template is used to then create the most important one, which is the pluggable database. Now, the pluggable database, you can have more than one inside your container. You can have 2, 3. I think the max is like 232 or 252, something like that. And inside the pluggable database, this is where you have all the various table spaces. And it is quite important because any changes that you make are inside that pluggable database. Sitting outside that, as the other guys explained, is the fast recovery area. We just call it a fast recovery area or a FRA, but I mean, you could call it anything. You can call it, it's from Satan, I forgot something, it's fairly slow, I'm feigning sickness, whatever it is, but we call it the fast recovery area because that is where all the archive logs are kept. And inside where the archive logs, basically this, the archive logs have a retention policy, or RMAN can set up a retention policy, which is how long I want to keep the archive logs, and then when do I want to delete them. So you can have it 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, etc. It just depends on how you want to run your business. Standard 5 days. So you'll have 5 days, and then on the 5th day it will delete the last lot and recreate. And that is a basic Oracle database structure. As I said, changes are all made inside the pluggable database. So that is one of the most important areas. And when you change something in the pluggable database, what it does is it deploys it to the archive logs. So it's backing up all the time. So it's making the changes, it's keeping all your data, because you've got to remember that every time you insert, delete, or update, it's going to apply here to this fast recovery area. or as we call it, the FRA. Right, so having looked at that, we're going to have a look at the basic backup process. So as I said, we at ProDBA use RMAN because it's an Oracle tool, and that's what we do. So you've basically, the first thing you do is you start off with an Oracle script. Okay, and this has various commands, and basically what we do is we put a script together that says, right, let's kick this process off. And the first thing it does is it's going to do a check. It's going to do a check on the archive logs, where they're stored, and if they're consistent. And as I said before, this is where all the DML statements are written into the archive logs, which is the update, insert, delete. And it's busy doing this while the actual database is being backed up. The next thing that it's going to check is going to do a cross check on the backup commands, and if anything in the backups folder has been deleted. So if someone has been into a place where they shouldn't be and they've accidentally deleted something, this procedure or the commands are there to actually say, right, if the retention policy is 5 days, I need to create one for that's been deleted and add in an extra backup. So what it's doing is that it's just maintaining the retention policy of 5 days worth of archive logs and backups. So that is the RMAN checks. Once it's done that part of its process, it then moves on to the actual backup itself. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at the container, the seed, and the pluggable, and it's going to say, right, let's get this thing backed up. So the RMAN tool kicks off, and what it's actually going to do is it's going to take some specific files and it's actually going to compress them. The files that it needs is everything that's in the container, everything that's in the seed, everything that is in the pluggable. It then takes all the archive logs and it takes the control files. And what it does is it compresses them up into a series of files, and it names them. So it'll call it IFST 2809 blah 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 /DBC or DBC PDS or pluggable or something like that. It'll have a naming convention. Once it does that, it then looks at the retention policy. How many days do I need to keep this? So if it's created on the Friday, it then will look and say, oh, well, I need to delete what's gone on Sunday or Saturday or whatever the retention policy is. So then it'll delete the last set of archive logs. It'll delete the last set of backups while it's creating a new one. In essential, that is what the script is going to do. And it's really as simple as that. When setting it up, yes, you've got to have a little bit more expertise, to get all this right, because it needs to be checked and it needs to be fired off. And we usually do that through a task scheduler. And then we can monitor it to say, right, the backup started here and it finished here. And if there's a problem, disk space and all that lovely stuff that Malcolm was talking about by monitoring, that is part of our process and stuff that we will check while we do run these backups. And it's all automated. If it goes wrong and something happens, when you restore, now this isn't, the guys have been talking about restoring. When you do the restore commands from RMAN, it actually creates the databases again using the backup files. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to recreate the container, seed, and pluggable, but these files are inconsistent. And what that means is that you would then have to run another process, which is the recover process. Now this deploys the backup plus the new archive logs. And you can even tell it to do it to a PITR or point in time recovery. So you've got your archive logs, and if it was creating new archive logs, you can say, oh, I want to recover up to that specific point. If you need more info or more information on that, just give us a shout and we can help you out with that. So when you recover, what it's going to do is it's actually going to deploy these archive logs into the container, the seed, and the pluggable, and you have a restored, recovered database. So that's the backup process in a nutshell. Right, so we're moving on, and we're going to look at updates and changes. Why would you do it? One, you want to keep data relevant, you want to keep your environments relevant, and then you want to benefit from functionality that comes out from IFS that they deploy in updates and any fixes that they might need to deploy to your system. So best way to do that is either is using clones. What you get from a clone is your latest data. So we know that your live database is always where your most up-to-date data is. When you copy your latest data it gives you a great test platform. So you're always working with, as we say, live data. Doing an update gives you the latest core and functional builds, and then you can start solving genuine problems. Now, there are several reasons for updating, and there's various times for updating. And when you can look at it at worst, middle, and best. Worst is going from 3 updates behind, 4 updates behind, to 4+ production releases behind. The reason why I say going from 3-4 updates behind, if you're on update 1 and you want to move to update 8, the difference or time difference between the releases or the updates can be quite large. So you're deploying more files and more updates onto your system. As Malcolm said, he had issues with update 11 and 13, which they combined into his apps 9 environment, and he said it took him 3 days. We had a customer that deployed, they wanted update 15, which is essentially update 11, which was the massive core one in our apps 9, and they were on update 1. And that took us 5, 6, 7 goes just to get right because of the gap. The other thing is production releases. The more you are behind, the longer it takes to deploy these releases. If you're going from release 10 to release 15 all in one day, greater downtime. If release 13 or release 14 is an update and you do up to release 14 and it goes in fine, and then the last release fails and it's in the database, it just means that your database is compromised, and then you possibly will have to roll back all the way to the beginning, unless you've got one of the newer databases where you can do a thing called a restore point, and just you can take restore points at each release. But just bear in mind that you will have more downtime. Obviously, the blend of 2 and 2 is good, and then the best is always to try and be up to date. So we're looking at clones and everything that needs to happen to a database, some of the pre-application processes needed for a clone. So the first thing you start off with is your database that needs to be cloned, and that is the target. And you've got to remember that the target database, for example, IFST going from IFSL, your target is going to get wiped out, completely destroyed. It's like, see, it's gone, wipe it. And basically what happens is replaced with the source. The source, i.e. IFSL, does not need to be down. So your source database doesn't need to be down, but your target one does. What it's going to do is it's going to run RMAN and SQL scripts, and it copies all the data files. It makes changes applied to your target, your archive logs, and that's why I said, it needs to be in log mode. And what it's going to do is essentially everything is going to change. So your test database is going to, the passwords, profiles, permission sets, custom fields, all of those lovely application bits that you've had in test gets wiped out, and it gets replaced with stuff in live. You've also got to then remember that all the data and everything that you had in test is now in live, and if you had access to test but you didn't have access to live, when it gets copied over, you won't have access to the test database, because effectively you're sitting with a copy of live. So post database clone, what needs to happen after you've actually done the Oracle side? You've got to connect your database and your middleware together. You then have to update the middleware, and this is to ensure that all the ancillaries are still the same. They're all connected. So the process is, right, you've got your source, your target, and your middleware. Source replaces your target, that gets wiped out, and then you run through your clone cycle, source, target, put your process in, update all the users. And the next thing is you have new data, and if you've got releases and just discrepancies between the source and the target, you have to take this into account. And the reason being is that if your target is at a higher level than your target is at a higher level than the source, it means then that your middleware will be at a higher release, but your database will be at a lower release. So that means then you then have to deploy your releases again. If the source is at a higher release than the target, so that means then you're copying over a database that has higher releases. That means then you don't have to, you have to deploy the release again, but only the middleware bit. So you still have to deploy, but only the middleware bit. So that means then you've got your database is up to date, but your middleware needs to be brought up to date. So you just got to keep those sort of things in mind. So restart everything up, you reconfigure it, deploy your releases, and then you use. And that's where you deliver it to your users and you let them test between your test instance and your production, and then you can compare. When you're happy, then you go on to the deployment of your release in live. And that's one of the reasons why you do a clone, is to test a release and fix some data. Right, you've also got to remember that this changes your environment completely. It's a virtual copy of the source, great test platform, also latest data. However, any dev work, you might need to reapply if you haven't applied it in live as well. So you just need to be aware of that. Okay, so now we're going to look at pre-release and the connections and what you need to do for pre-release, because there is quite a few. So you need access to the database and you need access to the middleware home. I want to talk about the middleware home. It's a set of folders that have access to the middleware servers, HTTP admin, server, main server, and the node manager. And this is a typical setup of an Apps 10 environment. You also need access to the application, services, and the task manager. And the reason that you need access to the application is, one, you need to do some background jobs checks. You need to actually go into the install components and see which release you're on. Really important that, because installing our releases out of sync without IFS permission can have some integral issues within the application and database. IFS don't like it. They get very antsy about it. Excuse me. If you do need to deploy a release out of sync, you need to check with them first, and if they give you the go ahead, then you can do it. The services, stop-start services, specifically in the newer releases and the newer updates, that you have to go and target the Solar, which is, I think, is used for document indexing, and then task manager. Specifically in the updates is that you have to go and check this, because the middleware homes, Java processes, there's only to be one Java process running. If there's more, it could mess things up quite a bit. You got to be able to connect to, between all of this and the database. So what you will need is passwords, because this is quite important. You need the sys, IFS sys, and IFS app passwords. You might not always need them, but you will need them to connect. Sys, this is the Oracle system user, and you might need this because it has privileges to perform certain elements in the database. The IFS sys is basically the IFS system user, and that you need that to connect to middleware, and then application IFS app is the app owner, and that has grants on system views and provides views to tables and packages. And then there's one more password that you need, and that is to the main server. It used to be nice and easy. It used to be called Oracle 1 exclamation mark, but in IFS, with security, it's now changed to some illegible jumble of, about 30 different letters and numbers. Something like Elon Musk's child's name, it's like illegible. And you need to actually break that connection between the application and the main server, or connect onto it. So that is pre-release connect. So you need to take all that into account. Right. So the next thing, this is what the filed version of a pluggable database looks like. As you can see, this is the actual container that I've circled, and at the top there, you've got a nice yellow folder that says PDB, pluggable database, and then you've got the seed underneath it. And on the right hand side of the image is just connecting excuse me, to SQL Plus, and this particular database is in no archive log mode. If I wanted to do an update, or if I wanted to do a cold back, not a cold backup, but a hot backup, which is what we like to use on apps 10 is a restore point, I would have to change it to archive log mode to actually tell it this is where I want to recover from. And then I'm just showing you the job queue processes, because this becomes quite important further down the line. The next one I have here is the middleware, and this is what an IFS middleware looks like. As you can see, that's all the files and folders once it's been deployed. If you're not allowed access to this, don't be in there fiddling around with it. Guys, don't let anybody in here who aren't supposed to be in there, because if they delete something, it makes big messy. On the right hand side is the middleware server controller, and you have various actions that you can do. You can stop, start, check, and over here I did a status, and you can see at the bottom here that everything is running. Well, this is the managed servers part. The admin server is running. Right, now to apply a fix or an update, we're going to have a quick look at the end-to-end process. So as I said earlier, you need access to the database and the middleware. And the first thing you want to do is look at your middleware home and your database files, and you need to shut this down to do a backup. The middleware home, shut it down, take your backup. There are various methods you can use, snapshots, etc., but we like to stop it there and then, have all the changes and zip it up. For the database, some of the older databases, we need to shut those down and actually create a cold backup. So it shut it down, take all the files, copy them, or we can use the RMAN backups that have just run, or they might not be running. You can use them, but then you don't want to lose any data. For some of the newer databases, in the container databases, we can create a restore point, which is nice and quick and simple and easy. Next thing after you've done your backups is you restart everything up. And then you need access to the job queue processes in the database and the application. The job queue processes, what you need to do is you need to set that to 0. That's to tell IFS, don't run any background jobs. You set that to 0. And then what you do is you go into Solution Manager and you check that they're not running, because it can have an impact on what is deployed in the release. You also have another quick check of the installed components, or well, we do at ProDBA, and then Oracle objects. This is where you actually go and compile all the invalid objects. We do it from the application. Although they reside in the database, you do it from the application. It's safer that way. Reason being is that, we've seen some instances where somebody's issued a wrong command and, well, it then messes up the database. So once you've done all your checks, the next thing is the main server. And the main server is you need to stop it. And the reason that you need to stop it is these guys here, the users. Because if they don't have access to the main server, they cannot get onto IFS. And you want to stop these guys from making any changes or trying to make any changes within tables that you might want to update with the release. Okay, so once you've stopped it, it's now time to do the release or the update. As everybody knows, you have an installer. And as I said before, the installer then connects to the database using the 3 IFS accounts, the SYS, the IFS SYS, and IFS app. And what it's going to do is it's going to run through its connection and make sure everything is good, and then it wants to deploy. And the first thing, it's going to do a range of things, but it's going to deploy some files. It's going to then take those files and then deploy this code into the database, and then it's going to update the middleware. If you're running an update, the difference between update 5 and update 7, the file size or the number of files could be, a 200 or 300 difference. If you're going from 1 to 8, the file size could be 1 trillion. You never know. But anyway, there's a whole set of files. It deploys it, copies them all over to where they need to be copied within either the middleware, the database, whatever it does. And then it runs code, and it deploys the code from the installer into the database. Depending on what it's doing is how long it takes. For an update, it could take anything from 2 hours to 5 hours. It just depends on what it's actually doing. When this has all happened and it's deployed successfully, it then runs through a couple of processes. The middleware, it analyzes, it does like an install stuff, it deletes, it configures, and then it runs all its updates like on Java, document management, middleware, web, mobile. And this process, it doesn't take too long. It's usually the code that takes the longest to deploy, but it's the stopping and starting of all the servers at the end. Usually on an update, it'll shut everything down and then start everything up again. That is the part that takes time, especially in apps 10. Once you have the update, you can then log into IFS, and then you've got to test your release, make sure that it is all working. Then you go back to the database and you reset your job queue processes. So, and then you go back and you make sure that your background jobs are actually running. And if that's all, good, then you have a successful release, which is great. So that is the process of applying a fix or an update to IFS from end to end. So when it deploys files, as I spoke about earlier, that was copying 907, but I mean that can range from 970 to 15,000 or 30,000. It just depends on the size of the update, the size of the database, how new IFS is. So luckily this one only 907 files, but it still took about 15-20 minutes. Deploying the code, this is what it looks like, a nice big code logging window, and it just runs, and all it does is it just runs these nice green, yellow commands, and that is it deploying it actually into the database itself. Right. Lastly, what we're doing is just look at some considerations. After you've cloned a database, remember your test databases are now the same size as your live. And if you're backing up your test databases, you've got to account that the test database is now considerably larger. You're going to need more space, and it's going to take a little bit longer. When you're deploying releases, you've always got to take into account IFS instructions, IFS notes. For the updates, some of the instructions can be pretty intimidating, because it's anything from 10 pages to 17 pages worth of stuff that you need to read through and make sure that you've got it all right. And then the process duration will differ. It depends on the database size for a clone and also the type of release in the application. And then lastly, just some extra disk space, for your backups. manual scripts if you're deploying releases, and then deployment times. And that is a couple of IFS / backup processes in a nutshell. So I'll hand back over to Amanda or Malcolm. We'll take it from there.
Thank you, Gary. I think we're actually going to go to Paul. Let's get Paul there.
Let me just bring up this one. Cool, there. Forgive the delay. So thanks, Gary. That's a really good run through. And this is a bit that could be a bit awkward.
No worries.
So ProDBA are good, and I need to be careful about what I say here, because pretty much I think a lot of people in the user group membership use them, and it becomes quite clear. Alternative partners within the IFS partner network are Oracle and Capgemini, and I think it would probably be a really good process for you to go out and kind of get quotes on getting the kind of services and so on from each of them, and then pretty much I think the answer would become self-evident. The other thing that we should mention is that quite a few of the partners are now offering fully managed service desks, so Cooper, Vanilla and Cedar Bay, and they will front up a lot of these services and actually do that interaction between ProDBA and yourselves as well, if you want to kind of take that hands off depending on what size of team that you've got. So there are some options out there. If you want to discuss any of them, then obviously you've got all of our contact details to come against, or you can put a message onto the IFS user group website for the networking side on what, how, where, etc. Or you can approach the companies direct. It's entirely up to yourselves. So no, thank you. And I guess pretty much that's it for the presentation. I guess we probably want to be looking at some of the questions that we've got. I don't know if you want to take that part, Amanda, or do you want me just to kind of go through them?
Yeah, I'll take that. That's fine. I'll leave your face just as it is at the moment in case you're going to answer, so bear with me.
Sorry, people.
Can the backup process be used to create discrete test environments?
Yes. That's essentially what Gary's just been running through.
Yeah, I think the question was asked just before that.
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Yeah.
What is the biggest database you have worked with?
Us individually or Gary and Andrew?
I think any of you possibly, I don't know.
My database is quite small in the Oracle comparison world. So it depends on your estate and stuff. Some Oracle databases can be terabytes, petabytes. It depends how they're used. But you go up to a different Oracle level when you start getting into that size of database. All the tools are the same, but the beast of recovery is a totally different animal. I think is the best way of putting it, Gary.
Hello, it's Andrew here at ProDBA. Hello, everyone. At ProDBA, we support multiple databases that are multiple terabytes in size. Your largest IFS database flow is probably a terabyte or so, and a lot of them are only a couple of 100 gigabytes. But Oracle can support databases that are many, many terabytes in size.
See, that's the depressing bit because it's Paul here. Ours, I think, is 1.2 terabytes, and that's after a re-implementation. It was 3.5 terabytes before we did that. And one of the things that you have to be careful of is just exactly what you're actually capturing within the processes. So one of the things that I didn't mention, but I should have done, is where you kind of get the business ownership of some of those processes taken away, and they put in node processes and they want to capture quite a lot of custom fields, you can find that that actually leads to quite a lot of database bloat quite quickly. And it's quite easy to be the kid in the candy shop that kind of, right, that feature's there, I want to turn it on and see what it does. And your database will grow quite quickly because of that, not necessarily for the good because you've got performance issues. So I think there's what is the database size, but also what is the performance of some of those bigger ones. And for us at Fireball, we had to do a re-implementation to get that into line. And the growth rate is now far more reduced, but obviously we want to capture all the nuances of how we make and ensure the quality of our products and how we then sell them on, that we had to do that piece with. So
Okay, thank you. Pete has a quick point he wants to give to add to Gary's process on cloning DBs. Says, when cloning from live, be aware of any sensitive data, salaries, bank details, HR journals, details of confidential meetings, etc. You may want to mask this data in the test systems.
Definitely. It is a consideration, you know, when you're cloning, that what you have in live is essentially what you're going to be seeing in tests. So it's always good for the administrators to, once they've had the clone, is then to go through some sort of data cleanse, specifically in those type of areas like your HRs and some of the company details.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So that's all the questions we have at the moment. So I shall wrap up, if that's okay. I hope you all enjoyed that and found it to be useful and informative. A big thank you to Paul, Malcolm and Gary for their presentations, and to Andrew for his technical support, and to ProDBA for supporting the IFS UK and Ireland User Group Summer Conference. We've got 8 more events planned during 2020. We added 2 more last week, so have another look at our events pages, and we're still in conversation with other partners to add more events over the next few weeks and months. We hope to see you all again at an event very soon. Thank you all very much for attending today, and thank you for your continued support of the user group. Please send us feedback about this event so that we can improve if necessary. Stay safe and well, and hopefully we'll see you all in person in the not too distant future. Many thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you all, gentlemen.
Bye-bye.